Gambit accepted arises after d4, d5, c4, and d takes c4. Now white has two main options. One is aggressive e4, and another one is super solid knight f3. In this video, we will also cover natural queen a4 and natural but dubious knight c3. Let's start with the check, as you might face it a lot of times if your opponent is not familiar with QGA. And the first thing that he wants to do is just to regain the pawn. So after queen a4, black has a lot of good choices, but I had to choose one. I like knight d7. We are developing the knight, covering the check, and supporting e5, which is very important in Queen's Gambit accepted. Queen takes c4, e5. Now after d takes e5, knight takes e5, we have a lot of tempos and easy development. So let's try to see what happens after knight f3. Then we can simply take the d4 pawn, queen takes d4, and knight gf6. First, we have to develop the knights to be able to play bishop c5 next, so that we don't drop the g7 pawn. So bishop g5, bishop c5, queen a4, and short castle. Now white didn't achieve anything in this position. Black has very easy play ahead, and we developed very fast moves like rook e8, h6, knight b6, and bishop f5 can be considered. Now let's take a look at the dubious option, knight c3. Now white is dubious because, first of all, it's not clear if the knight belongs to c3, as after natural a6 and b5, we have a tempo b4. And also, it does not control e5 square, which is very important in Queen's Gambit accepted, also does not support the d4 pawn. So after knight c3, we play logical a6. We want to play b5 next and support the c4 pawn. White can either play a4 and avoid it, or try to transpose into Catalan type of positions with g3. But here we have very interesting way to deal with it, not to have a headache. Do we play Catalan or not? Shall we transpose or not? We can deal with it with a straightforward breakthrough e5. This is very common, and you will see it a lot of times in the QGA sidelines. So after e5, what we gain is that we are ahead in development and grab the initiative very soon. D takes e5, then we can simply take queen takes d1, knight takes d1, and knight c6. We are threatening to take the e5 pawn. So after knight f3, we have bishop g4. Developing the bishop, and we are renewing the threat of bishop f3, e takes f3, and knight e5. Knight e3 is met with bishop f3, e takes f3, and knight e5. And now, unfortunately for white, white doesn't have time to regain the pawn on c4, as we have very annoying check on f3, and in case of f4, we can cover the diagonal and play knight d3. So black is doing very well in this line. After a6, natural to avoid b5, but then we play knight c6. We are attacking the d4 pawn as well as threatening to play e5 next. Knight f3. Seems like white comfortably defended the d4 pawn as well as controls the e5 square. But of course not, because we can still play e5 and grab the initiative. After e5, d takes e5, queen takes d1, knight takes d1, because king takes d1 is simply met with knight ge7. Next, we are playing knight g6, and then we are getting the e5 pawn. So after queen takes d1, knight takes d1, knight a5. This is the perfect way to annoy white and emphasize that a4 stopped b5 but made b3 square very weak. Now we're threatening to go bishop b4 and knight b3. Bishop d2, a very logical way to avoid bishop b4 and ask knight where it is going. But of course we're jumping to b3. Rook a2. Unfortunately for white, rook doesn't have good square. Rook a2 is met with bishop f5 because we are threatening to go bishop b1. You can also guess that rook b1 was met with very powerful bishop f5. So after rook a2, simple bishop f5. Now the only move is to play e4 and stop the bishop b1. Bishop takes e4 and bishop takes c4. Now we can simply take knight takes d2, king takes d2, and we can take this knight on f3, g takes f3, and short castle. And white's pawn structure is damaged and it is pretty weak. We have very good and easy development. Dark squared bishop is here to use the b4 weak square, as well as we will put pressure on the weak pawns after, say, knight h6, bishop out, and rook he8. So we have very good game after knight c3. And now let's take care of super solid option, which is knight f3. After knight f3, we go knight f6, and main move here is to play e3 to get the c4 pawn right away. Knight c3 can be played here, and this is the second most popular choice after e3. But here as well, we are responding in a natural way. We play a6, we are aiming to go b5 next, and after e4, because we already saw a4 was not worth of losing the tempo and stop the b5. e4, we simply go b5, and e5 is met with knight t5, a4, and now we can go e6. We have to be tiny bit careful with b4 right now, because after b4, say knight e4, if we don't have a good way to protect the c4 pawn, then we should be careful with move b4. We can simply go here e6 because development is very important, and after a b5, we can play bishop b4. Knight b6 is another solid option, but I like bishop b4 more because we are developing with tempo, putting pressure on c3 knight, and after queen c2, which is most logical and natural way to defend the c3 knight, then we can go knight b6. We are protecting the c4 pawn, and also with queen c2, we achieved that now the d4 pawn is slightly weak. Queen e4, no worries here, we're not losing the rook or anything, because now bishop c4 is kind of a threat. We go here queen d5. Remember, there is a pin, so we're not dropping the queen. Queen g4, because queen d5 just helps us, the trade, e takes d5, and we have perfect position. Sorry, queen g4. After queen g4, we can simply take on b5, because after rook a8, queen takes a8, now bishop e2, and after bishop e2, g6. Queen takes g7 is also possible, and it is covered in the video courses. Then we have very powerful game on the queen side with queen a1, and there is no way that white can avoid perpetual check. So queen bishop e2, g6, and after short castle, simple bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and h6. Next is bishop b7, knight d5, another knight to d7, maybe it can go to b6, knight a4. Black has zero problems in this position. Now let's go to the main line, which is knight f3, knight f6, and e3. Here we play e6, bishop takes c4, and c5. And white usually responds with short castle, but another variation is Furman variation, queen e2. The idea is to take on c5 without castling and without trading the queens. We simply play here a6, and after a6, d takes c5, we can take back, bishop takes c5, short castle, and knight bd7. Knight bd7 is pretty rare, but it's very interesting because I like not to commit to anything yet, not to play b5 or b6 or short castle, because knight bd7 is the move we will anyway need, and it's very flexible, gives us time to see what white is planning in this position. e4. This is a very straightforward choice from white. Then we go b5, bishop d3, bishop b7. We're using the fact that e5 is not working because then bishop takes f3 and e5 pawn will be weak. So knight c3, then we play bishop d6. We don't allow e5 anymore for the same reason, because after e5, bishop f3 and the e5 pawn is lost now. So e5, as I said, simply is met with bishop f3. And after queen takes f3 or g takes f3, we can simply take the pawn on e5, which looks very, very good for black. This is Furman variation. It is, of course, covered in details because white has a lot of choices. Here as well, knight c3 is another interesting option, which you can find in the video course. And short castle. After short castle, a6. And this brings us to the tapia position, because here white has a lot of options. The exchange variation with d takes c5, the gambit with e4, the old main line with queen e2, a4 to stop the b5, knight c3 just developing and intending d takes c5 afterwards. b3 is another way to develop this bishop on c1. Prophylactical moves like bishop b3, bishop d3, bishop e2, everything is covered in details in the video series. Let's start with d takes c5. This is the exchange variation. It's always been very popular, and you will find a lot of games nowadays as well. Now here black has two options, either to take on d1 or right away to take on c5. Taking on d1 keeps the option to castle short side, and taking on c5 loses the option to castle on king side. But when the queens are traded, who needs castle? We anyway need our king in the center. So that's why I recommend you to go bishop takes c5, and after queen takes d1, king takes d8, queen takes d8, king takes d8, bishop e2. This is very common in exchange variation because white wants to make the c4 square free. Let's say for the knight, maybe knight d2, knight c4. Also, it is very nice to have c file open after bishop d2, rook c1. And of course, white does not want to be under tempo because we can play b5 with tempo. So bishop e2 is a very common idea to drop the bishop back. King e7, just like bishop e2, we also need to get away from the check, and we want to have a more secure place for the king. So king e7, knight e5. This is also very common not to allow knight c6 easy development. Here we simply play knight bd7, and after knight c4, we can develop with b6. And now we want to play bishop b7, or even better, if white plays knight bd2, that we can simply go a5 with more active bishop a6, rook hc8. Black has perfectly fine position and very active counterplay on the queen side. Knight b3, bishop a6, knight takes c5. Now we can take bishop takes c5 to open the b file and have counterplay on b2 pawn. So f3 is met with rook hb8, rook f2, and a4. We don't want to allow b3 anymore, and we will follow the plan to bother the c4 knight with rook b4. Say e4 is met with rook b4, knight a3, and we can play now knight e5, bishop f4, and knight fd7, regrouping our knights, having very strong piece in the center, very good counterplay on the b file. Now the b2 pawn is hanging. Black is doing very good in this position. Now let's see another option for white, which is b3. This variation became very trendy lately, and some of our opponents might want to follow in the footsteps of none other than Magnus Carlsen, Ding Liren, Wesley So, and other strong players. So you will find a lot of different responses here from black side, but I think I have very easy solution, which is very rare, and I'd like to surprise your opponents with knight bd7. After knight bd7, bishop b2. I like knight bd7 before bishop e7 because I don't want to lose tempo with d takes c5 and bishop c5. So knight bd7 is kind of our go-to move. It's very flexible before we commit into anything. So knight bd7, bishop b2. Here we go, bishop e7 already, d takes c5, and after bishop takes c5, we are now not shy to lose a tempo as we avoided trade of queens. So b6, nothing new here, we're following our plan just to develop. Queen e2, bishop b7, rook fd1, short castle, rook ac1, and queen e7. And we are planning to go bishop a3 next with rook fd8 and rook ac8. Make sure that you don't drop the a6 pawn. Black has very solid position. This concludes the b3 line. We shall move to rook e1, which is also relatively new line that can become, of course, more popular. Rook e1 prepares e4. That's why we should not allow it in comfort, and we have to play knight c6 to put more pressure on d4 pawn. Now knight c3, we play b5, bishop d3. This is the best square for the bishop because I tried to play bishop f1, and after bishop b7, it's funny, but Anjin's first line was to come back bishop d3. So bishop d3 is the best move here, and after c takes d4, e takes d4, knight b4, a very nice square to jump to annoy the d3 bishop, as well as have full blockade of d4 pawn with knight d5. d5, this is a brave sacrifice, but with our precise play, it doesn't work. Knight takes d3, queen takes d3, and b4. We are kicking the knight out from the comfort zone so that it cannot defend the d5 pawn. Now after knight e4, bishop b7, knight d5 here is also possible, but I like to develop the bishop first, as d takes e6 is not possible because there is pin. So bishop b7, bishop g5, then we can take on d5, knight takes f6, g takes f6, queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop takes f6, and rook g8. And it's clear that material is equal, but we have two bishops, open g-file, and a very good potential attack on the king side to double on g-file, or also to take care of the queen side and provoke some weaknesses. So black is doing very well in this position as well and has an advantage. And now let's take a look at knight c3. This move has never been considered to be challenging theoretically, but recently it became pretty popular. White just develops the knight and wants to keep the option of d takes c5. We play here b5, bishop e2. Now, white has a lot of options here, bishop b3, bishop d3, bishop e2, but let's take a look at bishop e2, bishop b7, and d takes c5. Now, after bishop takes c5, queen takes d8, king takes d8, and a3, we have very nice version of exchange variation. a3 white, it intends to transpose into symmetric setup with b4. We can simply develop our knight bd7, b4, and now it is important to keep an eye on this b4 pawn and not leave the f8, a3 diagonal and play bishop d6, because bishop b6 is met with very powerful move a4. So bishop d6, bishop b2, and king e7. Next is rook hc8, rook c7, rook ac8. Black is doing perfectly fine in this endgame. Let's take a look at other white's option, which is the old main line, queen e2. Now the idea of white is that he wants to have a setup with queen e2 and rook d1. And I don't really like to step into this setup, so I don't recommend you to go, let's say, c takes d4 and allow rook d1. We can simply go b5, bishop b3. This is old main line, old and forgotten. We can simply play here bishop b7, and after rook d1, knight bd7. We close the d file, and after knight c3, we have time to unpin ourselves with queen takes c7, queen c7, even though bishop e7 or bishop d6 is perfectly fine as well, but we can afford the tempo, queen c7, e4, and now it is important because when white plays e4, white wants to go either e5 or d5. And the simple solution to this is just to grab the pawn. So e4 almost always is automatically met with c takes d4, knight takes d4, and bishop c5. Now with c takes d4 and knight takes d4, we not only achieved that there is no e5 or d5 anymore, but we also lured the knight into the center, knight d4, and now we have full control of e5 square. Bishop bishop e3, short castle, and rook ac1. Now we don't want to be under discovered attack, so we move the queen b6, f3, and after rook fd8, black has a very comfortable game intending to improve his position. Moves like rook ac8, knight e5, and h6 can be kept in mind. This concludes queen e2 line. Now let's see a4, avoiding b5. This is a very natural reaction to a6. Here we can simply take c takes d4, e takes d4. Now we transposed into IQP, isolated queen's pawns positions, but a4 and a6 inclusion is in black's favor as the b4 square is weak. So after knight c6, knight c3, bishop e7, we just develop and bishop e3, short castle, knight e5. Now, Queen e2 here has more games, of course, but I think that Knight e5 will be more trendy and there will be more games as it was played between Carlsen Caruana in 2020 online chess tournament in Magnus Invitational. So after short castle, let's take a look at Knight e5, and in the game Bishop d7 was played, but I think it's a bit better to play Queen c7, Knight c6, and after b takes c6, we have great game on b file, although it's possible to take here Queen c6 as well, but b takes c6 gives us more counterplay on the queen side. B takes c6, rook c1, we can simply play bishop b7, and guess what? We want to get rid of the c6 pawn and we want to play c5. Bishop d3, we just play here c5, and after d takes c5, we simply take bishop takes c5, knight a2, and if you think that we're losing the bishop, you're wrong, because we have here very powerful move, queen c6. Now, white is in trouble because we are threatening mate in 1 and f3 is not possible because this guy is hanging here with check. And how do you want to avoid the mate? Well, it's white's problem. Let's move and see one more line, which is a very brave sacrifice, e4. This is a gambit, it's very concrete, and we must know how to deal with it. After e4, it is possible to take the pawn on e4, but then you have to back it up with powerful engine analysis. And to be honest with you, I don't really like this option when we have more simple b5. After b5, if white goes bishop b3, then it makes huge difference because then we can take on e4 as we have c4 tempo. But after bishop d3, white of course protects the e4 pawn, then we can go bishop b7, as if we take the pawn on d4, c takes d4, then after a4, white has good initiative. So we don't want that, we simply develop bishop b7, put more pressure on e4 pawn, and after bishop g5, pinning the knight, we can go simple bishop e7, e5, and knight fd7. Knight d5 is perfectly fine as well, but knight fd7, bishop e7, queen c7, bishop e7, queen takes e7, we have a typical position, a4, and short castle. Now we are ignoring that the b5 pawn is hanging because after a takes b5, a takes b5, rook takes a8, bishop takes a8, and bishop b5, we have simple c takes d4, and if knight d4, e5 pawn is hanging, and if queen d4, then we simply take the knight on f3, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, queen g5, and after king h1, we anyway get this pawn. Queen takes e5, black successfully regained the pawn, damaged white's king side pawn structure, and the king is weak and we have very comfortable endgame. This concludes knight f3 line. Of course, it's much bigger and there are much more lines, but now we shall get to the most aggressive e4 move. Now the idea of e4 is just to have strong center and grab the c4 pawn as fast as possible. As black, we should not allow white to have it all. We should challenge white's center. And this variation and the Queen's Gambit accepted is based on an exciting exchange sacrifice. That is considered to be dubious, but believe me, with powerful engine analysis, you are backed up with amazing compensation and you will prove everybody wrong. b5, we're protecting the c4 pawn, and the only way to challenge it is to play a4, c6, and here the exchange sacrifice I'm talking about is with a takes b5, c takes b5, knight c3, a6, knight takes b5, a takes b5, and rook a8. But before we touch that, let's cover some sidelines. After a4, c6, white can go knight c3, but this transposes into the main line if we play a6. And if white doesn't want to transpose, then he can try to play knight f3, but then bishop b7, white doesn't have anymore a chance to take on b5 as a takes b5, c takes b5, and our rook is defended. Then after knight f3, bishop b7, a takes b5, c takes b5, b3 can be played, but after c takes b3, queen takes b3, e6, black has no problems. Knight b5 is a sacrifice, but we can take the pawn on e4, and after bishop f4, aiming knight c7, now we can go a takes b5. Bishop takes b5, knight d7. Rook takes a8, bishop takes a8, because we have to be careful. Queen takes a8 runs into bishop d7, king d7, and knight e5, and this is very bad position for us, but we can take back with the bishop. Bishop takes a8, bishop d7 now is met with queen d7, and white does not have anything better than perpetual check because he is pieced out, so he has to play queen b8, queen d8, queen d5, queen d7, and queen b8. The game will end in a draw. Another interesting line, sorry, I jumped right into the end. We don't need that. c6, another line is to play b3 directly. And the idea to play b3 is to destroy black's pawn chain right away until we are developed. But here we have very powerful breakthrough in the center, e5. Once again, you meet this move and idea which we've covered a lot of times in the knight f3 variation. So e5 we want to develop as fast as possible and grab the initiative. Also challenging white's center. D takes e5, then we play bishop b4 check, bishop d2, and here by giving check what we achieved. We closed the d file, we play here bishop c5, and the bishop is on d2 already, so we are threatening queen d4. Double attack on f2 and a1 rook. Knight f3 to control the d4 square. Knight e7, now we have very, very easy development. And if b4, then bishop b6. B takes c4 or a takes b5 is of course an option here, but let's cover b4, bishop b6, knight c3. Now with b4, white achieved to secure the c3 square for the knight, but we have very strong c4 pawn now. Short castle, we are ignoring that a b5 pawn is hanging, so a takes b5. We don't need this pawn, we can play simple bishop e6, protecting the c4 pawn, and after bishop e2, simple c takes b5, knight takes b5, and knight bc6, black achieved a perfect harmonious position. Short castle, simple knight g6, now we are getting to e5 pawn, bishop ce3, queen e7, keeping an eye on b4 pawn as well as on e5 pawn after bishop g4 if needed. Knight d6 can be met with rook a d8, and black is threatening to take the pawn on e5 now, and rook d6 later. Also the ideas with f6 might be considered. Black is doing very good in this position. That is it for the sidelines. Now let's take care of main line. A takes b5, c takes b5, knight c3, and a6. This was first introduced in the game of Ganjlin-Dunchenko, March 2014, and the exchange sacrifice really looked brilliant. It was very, very trendy for a while, and then it was picked by none other than Hikaru Nakamura, ex-world champion Rustam Kasimdzhanov, Mamedyanov, Ponomarev. A lot of strong players played this in 2006, and then White started to look much more seriously at this line. So for now, it's considered to be a dubious sacrifice. But I hope that this video series will change everything and will make sure that this sacrifice works. Knight takes b5, a takes b5, and rook a8. Bishop b7, and this is the first critical position of the third e4 variation. Now, White rook can go back to a1, which is main line, back to a2, which has subtleties and differences between rook a1 and rook a2, rook a7 to force us to move the bishop or give back the rook and take rook b8. Taking rook b8, giving back the exchange and hoping to destroy black's pawn chain doesn't really work, because we can simply take queen takes b8, b3 is met once again with powerful e5 ideas, d5, now we got very nice c5, b4 square, we first give check, bishop b4, bishop d2, and tempo, c3, and now White is in trouble as we are threatening to play c2 if the bishop moves. Now we shall take a look at rook a7. Rook a7 forces us to take on e4, then we can simply take b3 and knight c6. We're meeting b3 with tempo, developing the knight. Knight c6, rook a2, and knight b4. Now you have to be cautious, because if we are too greedy and take the pawn on d4, we might be in trouble after rook d2. So knight b4, rook b2, and queen a5. We are threatening knight c2 and knight d3, double check. Bishop d2 is the most logical response to that, and queen a3. And who would think that we would bother the rook on b2? But suddenly the queen is such a powerful piece that after queen a5, queen a3, now the rook has to be taken care of. Queen c1, and now tactics. Boom! Bishop g2. This is a tactical blow which works perfect in this position. Bishop g2 is met with knight d3 and White is losing queen. So b takes c4, then we can play knight d3 anyway. Bishop takes d3, queen d3. We are threatening mates. Oops. Bishop f1. Sorry, queen f1, knight e2. Bishop h1. C takes b5, and it is true that now White is piece down, but of course there is compensation because we didn't yet develop our pieces, so we need some space for our king and a clear plan to develop. f5. There is no need to stop the b7 pawn, b5 pawn, because we need to give up our bishop and take care of the development. b6, bishop b7, and afterwards we can play king f7, let's say anything like queen c7, etc. is met with bishop b7, queen e4 at some point, knight f6, king f7, and g6. So that's why White has to be careful and not play b6 right away, but first has to give check, king f7, and the line is very, very interesting, pretty sharp, but Black is doing very good in this line as well. This concludes rook b8 and rook a7. Now let's get to move rook a2. After rook a2, we play here e6, knight e2. It is important to have the diagonal open for the bishop, because we of course want to develop our knight, but the fastest development is to have open diagonal and have bishop b4 check at some point. After knight e2, white wants to put the knight to c3. So after knight c3, white is defending very nicely the e4 pawn and puts pressure on b5 pawn. We should not allow this, thus we take bishop takes e4. b3 is met with knight f6, b takes c4, and b takes c4. Now, this is a novelty, queen a4 here, but this is probably the most natural move that comes to mind. Queen a4, bishop c6, queen takes c4, and bishop e7. Unfortunately, it doesn't yet work for us to play bishop d5 and win the rook, as white has check queen a4 or queen b5. So bishop e7, f3, short castle, knight c3, and now we have to fight for the d5 square. It is a very nice example of a compensation, full compensation for the exchange, because it seems like it's just an exchange, and if white develops simple bishop d3 or bishop e2 short castle, what kind of compensation do we have? First of all, we have very powerful pieces and active pieces, two bishops, and f3 weakened the king side. Another important thing is d5 square, and of course, very weak d4 pawn. So now we have to fight for d5 square, and we play knight d5, not allowing white to develop comfortably. Knight d5, now knight d5 is met with bishop d5, and we're doing very good. Rook b2 is simply met with knight takes c3, queen takes c3, bishop h4, another nice way to provoke weaknesses on the king side. g3, bishop f6. Now we provoke to g3, we can get back and put pressure on d4 pawn. So you can see everything works here very well for black. Rook d2, rook is going back and forth, closing the c1 bishop. Queen d7, king f2. There is no nice way to develop, because after queen d7, we also want to play rook d8 and put pressure on d4 pawn. Rook c8. Now, because after bishop a3, we can simply have a tempo. Bishop d5, queen e3, and a useful move. It's time for a useful move. h6, giving space to our king, as well as threatening bishop g5. h4 is a logical way to respond this, to take away the g5 square, and after knight c6, putting more pressure on d4 pawn, bishop e2. Now we have a choice. We have a choice of rook d8, rook a8, and rook e8. I like rook e8 the most because it has clear plan in mind. After rook e8, bishop c5, we play e5. Once again, opening the files to get closer to white king. It might be strange because you might think, we are exchange down. Why aren't we trying to just sit passively and do something about the material? Because simplifying the position, if you are material down, is not, of course, in your favor, right? But here, the point is that this king is very weak, and we have very good pieces, active pieces in the center. So we need e5, because everything works well with tempos. D takes e5, knight takes e5, and now our target is f3 pawn. We can play queen f5 at some point, threaten knight g4, even now knight g4 is a threat, and put pressure on f3 pawn. So rook h d8, queen f5. Now after knight g4, it would not be as good because f takes g4, our bishop is hanging. Afterwards, rook takes d5, and we would not have enough material to keep knight g4, f takes, rook takes, and rook d5. This doesn't look good. So we need to play a clever move, queen f5. After queen f5, we are threatening to go knight g4. So white has to do something about it. After queen f5, knight g4, rook d5 is an option, of course, here. After queen f4, we simply play queen h3 and getting closer to the king. And if rook d5, then simple knight g6, queen c4, we play knight f4 here. A brilliant sacrifice to make sure that white king is in trouble. This is really spectacular as we are threatening now to take on e2, and this brings us closer to the victory. Queen f4, queen h2, king f1, then we simply take the e2 bishop with rook takes e2, and there is no way that white can avoid queen g2 mate, so black is winning here. Now let's get back and see the main line, which is 9 rook a1. After rook a1, e6. Once again, it's important to have the file open, and knight e2. Instead of knight e2, white has pretty a lot of options here. f3, things go crazy here. Knight e2, pretty ambitious, and pretty relaxed bishop e2 or knight f3. Let's start with bishop e2 because it doesn't matter white starts with knight f3 or bishop e2, it transposes into each other. Now we have to be careful not to take this pawn on e4 because that's too much. When we are material down, we have to take care of initiative and development. And we will get initiative if we are ahead in development. So knight f6, knight f3. Now we can take the pawn on e4 because it's knight takes e4, but we can have a better version of taking the pawn as we can give first check, bishop b4, bishop d2, then bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, and knight takes e4. This is the simplest. After short castle, we can short castle as well. Knight takes e4, bishop takes c4. Let's just see an example variation. White, of course, has a lot of choices here, and this is pretty critical position, but let's take a look at one move, which is b3. But this one, we can meet with queen d5. Now a battery on the long diagonal will be a huge headache for white, as we are putting pressure on g2 pawn, and white doesn't want to play g3, of course, because then weak white squares will be a huge disaster for white. And also we have b3 target. Now f3 is kind of forced, which weakens dark squares, and we can play bishop d3. Closing the d file means taking the pawn on d4 with check. B takes c4, b takes c4, bishop takes d3, queen takes d4, king h1, and c takes d3. And even if white at some point will win the d3 pawn with rook a3 or rook a2, etc., the endgame for black is completely fine, as 4 against 3 exchange down. This is fortress, and white cannot do anything. White cannot progress. So this is all about the solid bishop e2, knight f3 line. Now let's see f3. After f3, f5. We are challenging the center because white wants to have it all strong center and extra material. We should not allow this. f5, e takes f5, and after e takes f5, which is main move, there are a lot of crazy lines here that we have to know how to deal with, but it gives black full compensation and great game, and it is white who has to be cautious. Say g3 is very interesting here, knight h3 with knight f4, and piece sacrifice with bishop takes c4 is very interesting option, which is of course covered extensively in the video series. Now let's take a look at the main line. E takes f5, and we didn't play f5 just to trade the pawns on f5, but instead we play knight c6. We destroyed white's harmony in the center, and we are pushing the d4 pawn. But even after f takes e5, e6, we don't need to take this d4 pawn. There are a lot of other options like knight e2, bishop e3 here, but let's take a look at f takes e6, knight g e7. This is fun because we are not even taking the pawn on d4, but we want to have fast development. We want to play knight f5 first, then take on d4, and then bishop b4. And look at this. Look at this. It seems like white was playing only with pawns, and just this knight is missing. It was jumping around for 12 moves, and then it just sacrificed itself. So bishop c4. This is completely unexpected but necessary because we are threatening to go knight f5. B takes c4, knight e2. This is very critical line because white now gave up 2 pieces for the rook, and he has 3 pawns. But we have very strong squares, and actually this d4 and e6 pawn, they are weak. So we can simply play knight d5, successfully blockading the d4 pawn and opening diagonal for the bishop. Oh, not for the king, but for the bishop. So short castle, bishop d6, queen a4. Now our pieces are all looking at the king side. Short castle, queen takes c4, and knight ce7. Look at this beautiful blockade of e6 and d4 pawn and the b2 pawn. This will never be promoted. Bishop g5, h6, bishop e7. Now white follows the rule, if you have extra material, you have to simplify. That is true, but we have 2 pieces for the rook. So we can go queen e7, rook a7, and now knight e3. Because there is no more bishop controlling the c1, h6 diagonal, we can play knight e3, queen b5, and here starts the fun. We don't need to take the rook first, but we include queen h4. Look at these beautiful pieces looking at king side. Ooh, dangerous. f4, the only way to avoid queen h2 mate. f4, now we take bishop f4. This activates bishop g2 sacrifices as well. Knight f4, knight f1. After knight f1, we are again threatening to take queen h2. Queen b7, then queen h2, king f1, rook f4, king e2, and queen g3. Now we're protecting the g7 pawn and threatening rook f2. Queen b8. This is the only way that white has to find to stay in the game. King h7 and queen e5. The only maneuver, queen is absolutely necessary on e5. Luckily for white, d4 pawn is still there, so rook f2 does not win a queen because the queen is defended. But we have rook f2, king e1, rook f4, and white cannot escape the checks, so there is no point to try and avoid move repetition with king e2 and rook f2. This is the f3 line, and it's totally crazy, but it's a lot of fun, and black is doing always very well in this line. It's very sharp, and white has to be careful because the pieces, when it is about the king, it's much better to have bishops and knights to control the diagonals and the squares than extra exchange. So now let's take a look at the last option, which is knight e2. After knight e2, white wants to play knight c3 as in rook a2 line. We cannot allow this, so we shall take on e4, and after knight c3 we have bishop b4. Now we are pinning the knight, so there is no knight e4, bishop e2, knight f6, short castle, and now it's better to take on c3 rather than go back to c6. So we just take, not to lose any tempo, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and short castle. Knight d5 was played in some games, but I don't think it's necessary because we are not afraid of bishop g5 pin. So we can play simple short castle, and after bishop a3, bishop g5 is another critical option here for black, but black is doing very well. Bishop a3, we can simply play rook e8, and after bishop f3, it is important to keep the bishops and take it with tempo, not to take on f3, but simply play bishop d5. Because after bishop d5, white has to think twice to take this bishop on d5 or not, because we have an option to take with knight, to take with pawn, and to take with the queen. So bishop d5 keeps the tension in the center, and after bishop c5, we can now develop our knight, knight c6, rook a6, knight a5, and we are sneaking into the weak b3 square. Bishop d6 to reroute the bishop, knight b3, bishop e5, and now we can take bishop takes f3, bishop f6. White wants to simplify the position and not allow any bishop knight d5. Also queen f3 can be met with knight d2, so bishop f6, queen takes f6, queen takes f3, queen takes f3, g takes f3. White simplified the position, but now the active b4 solves all the problems, because after c takes b4, c3, black is aiming to go c2 and c1. We have tactics, because after rook c6, we meet this with knight d4, and black cannot take the c3 rook as we have knight e2 check. This is all about the Queen's Gambit accepted, and I hope that this was a nice overview of the repertoire. Of course, it is much bigger and I cannot show you all the lines in 1 hour, but everything is covered in details in the video series. I hope you liked the video. I wish you good luck in your games, and I hope that I will see much more games with Queen's Gambit accepted and the exchange sacrifice in the future than it is now. Wish you good luck. See you next time.